members and guests. I'm here to talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition. When my brother and I were in the 6th grade, my parents gave us for Christmas a book about the Lewis and Clark expedition. I had never heard of this before, but I found this thing fascinating and have been fascinated by it ever since. Let me say I have nothing financially to disclose, and artificial intelligence had nothing to do with the preparation of this talk. So what was the Louisiana Purchase? Well, basically, it was the mid-portion of the United States had been transferred back and forth from control of Spain to France, back to Spain, back to France. And when Napoleon was in power, he needed money to finance one of his wars. So Thomas Jefferson approached him in 1801 to try to purchase about half of this territory. He eventually, 2 years later, purchased it all for the sum of $15 million, or a famous 3 cents per acre. This is about $340 million in today's money, or about 65 cents an acre, but still a pretty good value. Showing that presidents don't really change. He didn't bother notifying Congress for 2 years about these negotiations. This was a military expedition. It was to explore the country and assert U.S. control. So this was an army, 2 captains led it. There were 33 to 35 men. In those days, there were no physicians assigned to army expeditions, so the officers were expected to be their men's physicians and surgeons. Towards this end, Lewis spent about 3 weeks in Philadelphia with a physician named Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. It's not clear from his writings how much time he actually spent with Rush. It was probably no more than a few hours, though. But Rush had several recommendations of the medicines that he should take with him. Most of these, we'll see, were probably useless, if not actually dangerous. The first 3 were probably the only ones that were useful. Pulverized Peruvian bark, which contained quinine, which could treat malaria. Malaria, though, was not specifically diagnosed and was used for any case of a high fever. Laudanum and tincture of opium were used for pain, and these next 2 items were actually used to treat venereal disease. Also in his medicine chest, he had a set of instruments. It's never specified what these instruments are. He had a set of teeth instruments, so presumably they were their men's dentists as well as their physicians and surgeons. There was something called a Clister syringe, which was an enema. This was presumably for constipation, but I suspect most of the men elected for a cathartic if they ever had severe constipation. Also, 3 lancets and a tourniquet, which was used for bleeding, and we'll discuss this in a little bit. This is the list of the medications that they took with them. Most of these are cathartics or emetics. This sal nitrate has an interesting story. If anybody wants to discuss it afterwards, I'm happy to tell you it's pretty humorous. They also had tincture of benzoin and 2 ounces of patent lint, which is what we would call fine mesh gauze. So 2 ounces of gauze for a 3-year expedition with 30 plus men. And then these assorted nutmegs, cloves, cinnamons probably make the medications taste okay. Total cost was $90.60. Well, what was surgery like in 1803? There was no anesthesia, there was no antibiotics, there was no asepsis, there were no operations. They didn't even suture lacerations. Now, some of the things we'll recognize is done today, but most of what they did, they took care of trauma, they took care of abscesses, they took care of frostbite, and they bled the men. Bleeding was was the provenance of what were called barber surgeons in Europe starting in the Middle Ages. But in America, it was a little more democratic, I guess you could say. There was no separate guild for the barber surgeons, and all physicians had bleeding as part of their education. And remember, this was all an apprenticeship back then. So just as some of the examples, this is the first entry in Lewis's journal. The party stopped a couple miles outside of Pittsburgh because some of the spectators heard he had an air rifle and they wanted him to demonstrate it. So the rifle accidentally discharged. The ball hit a woman 40 yards distance, cut her temple. The blood gushed out. They thought she was dead, but fortunately she revived to their inexpressible satisfaction. So possibly, if there was a bad outcome, the expedition may never have started. Lewis was the only member of the party to actually receive a gunshot wound, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Here's another example. Two men cut themselves with an axe. Men were constantly cutting themselves. No specific treatment was ever documented. Gibson put out his shoulder today, but got it back again. This is the third recorded instance of Gibson dislocating his shoulder. The first two times Clark put it back in place. Presumably by the third time, he was able to do it himself. Later on, this is in a Native American came to camp. I dressed the arm, which was broken above the wrist, supported it with broad sticks to keep it in place, and put it in a sling. This is most likely a Colles fracture. Colles, though, didn't report this till 6 years later. So if Clark had published this when he got back, we would possibly be calling this a Clark fracture nowadays instead of a Colles fracture. So Lewis got wounded late in the expedition as they were headed home. He was out hunting with one of the guides, and the guide accidentally shot him. And Clark found him the next day and said the wound was a very bad flesh wound. Yeah, Monty Python stole this. Ball had passed through the fleshy part of his left thigh, below the hip, cut the cheek of the right buttock for 3 inches in length and the depth of the ball. This is a .60 caliber ball he was shot with. It must have been very painful, as we can see from the next line, that Lewis actually passed out when he was changing the dressing. And they treated this wound anyway by secondary intent. Clark changed the dressing approximately every other day. And as we can see, he got gradually better and better, and no further mention is made after August 26th. Abscesses are mentioned at least 20 times. July 14th, several men were unwell with boils, felons, etc. Lewis records the tumor on Captain Clark's ankle discharged a considerable quantity of matter. Lewis had glanced at it the day before, and it was still draining. Man with a wife had an abscess formed in the small of her back. I presume this is a pilonidal abscess. Captain Clark opened the abscess, introduced a tent, and dressed it. Remember, this is the same gauze that was used to treat Lewis's wound about 3 months later. Charbonneau's child is very ill. He had a high fever, and his neck and throat are swollen. It later discharged on its own. The child didn't get better, so Lewis gave him an enema 4 days later. It operated very well, he reports, and the child is now clear of fever. This is the only instance in the journal I can find that anybody was given an enema. Or as I like to put it, the only one who ever received an enema was the only person who could not say no. Frostbite was a big challenge. Their clothes froze on them. One of us got his feet frostbit. They had some whiskey, which revived him, that universal treatment. The last one, the thermometer stood at 12 below zero, and I'll let you read the rest yourself, but that reticence in that one word is Clark's, not mine. Temperature fell to 74 degrees or 42 degrees below zero. This was the lowest temperature recorded on the expedition, but the thermometer broke a few days later, so quite possibly it was colder later that winter. But this is one of the few times they mentioned treatment more than once. A boy about 13 years of age came to the fort. This was a Native American. His feet were frozen and they put it in the cold water. So they knew, don't put these frozen extremities into hot water. It would have a deleterious outcome. Several weeks later, Captain Lewis took off some of his toes. Presumably dry gangrene had set in by then. The next few days, Clark took off toes from the other foot. But the boy apparently made a reasonable recovery and went home about 6 weeks later with his father. Bleeding. Bleeding again is mentioned at least 40 times in the journals. They bled for everything, assuming the cathartics and emetics didn't work, of course. Dates back to the 5th century. Hippocrates famously said, venesection holds first place in conducting the treatment. As we mentioned, it was a function in the Middle Ages of barber surgeons, but in addition to lancets, Europeans used leeches. France in 1833 alone imported over 41 million leeches for medicinal purposes. This is in addition to 20 to 30 million leeches that were domestically produced. It was advocated by Benjamin Rush, and certainly this is where Lewis learned how to do bleeding. He documented cases between 6 weeks and 91 years of age with what he called good results. Good result, of course, means the patient survived. He removed anywhere between 6 and 30 ounces. The only writing he has, which could be of all useful, he says, well, if you have a dislocation, maybe you can take off enough blood so the patient faints, and then you can replace the joint. If he ever did this, he never recorded it, though a couple of his contemporaries did. I won't go over all of the examples they used for which they used bleeding, but was common for any time was exposed to too much sun, because they had too much pulse then, and bleeding was done. Pleurisy was very common. Every time someone got pleurisy, they were bled. Sacagawea, our Indian woman, is very sick, and I bled her. She didn't get better, so Clark bled her again the next day. But Lewis found maybe a week later, in this case, it didn't really seem to take care of all of her symptoms, but Sacagawea did survive and eventually had another child. I'd like to next talk about two specific episodes that took place during the expedition. The first is the death of Sergeant Charles Floyd. He famously, there's a book called Only One Man Died, because only one man died during this expedition. So they must have done something correctly. Floyd wrote, I am sick and has been for some time, but I've recovered my health again. A few weeks later, they celebrated Lewis's birthday with an extra gill of whiskey. A gill is an archaic term. It's about 4 ounces. So this implies that they had 4 ounces was their daily ration. Anyway, next day, Sergeant Floyd gets ill. He's taken bad all at once with a bilious colic, which means severe abdominal pain and vomiting. They attempt to relieve him without much success and are much alarmed at his situation, and they gave all attention to him. As another member of the party wrote, Sergeant Floyd became very sick and remained so all night. And this is what Clark writes the next day. Sergeant Floyd, much weaker and no better. Bad as can be, no pulse and nothing will stay a moment on his stomach or bowels. Floyd died with a great deal of composure. Before his death, he said to me, "I'm going away. I want you to write me a letter." Sorry, every time I read this, I get choked up. Anyway, we buried him with all honor to our deceased brother, and we camped. It was a beautiful evening, he added somewhat laconically. Well, this greatly affected every member of the expedition, I'm sure. At least 7 members of the expedition kept a journal. Only 6 have been discovered. One of them as recently as 1950, so maybe number 7 will eventually come to light. But this is one of the few times where every member wrote something in his journal. He was laid out in the best manner possible. They put a red cedar post. They commend their officers for doing everything to save his life. This is what his gravesite looked like about 30 years later when the Western artist Charles Gallatin retraced their steps. And at the top of the hill is the red cedar post. It's since been washed away, as has his grave. But instead, this obelisk was placed at his gravesite. I took this picture in 1978. This is actually number 1 in the National Register of Historic Monuments. So, this is the first American soldier to die west of the Mississippi. He has severe abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea. It leads to death within 30 hours. What did he die from? Well, most writings say this was a ruptured appendix. Now, I took care of a lot of appendicitis in my professional career, and I don't say this would be an impossible scenario, but I think it's very unlikely. In addition, appendicitis wasn't that common in 1800. Indeed, the first case wasn't reported until 1812. And even then, the early cases were all insidious, people being sick for several days or a week before succumbing. I think it's more likely this was due to some sort of gastrointestinal infection or even food poisoning. Well, what are the possibilities? Well, cholera was epidemic in the world then, but usually it's diarrhea is the first symptom. It requires a water temperature above 70 degrees, and even in the summer, the Missouri River was not 70 degrees. And more importantly, it was not reported in the U.S. until 1830. Typhoid is a very attractive possibility. It has an insidious onset, and if you remember, Floyd wrote several weeks prior he hadn't been well. You get fever, abdominal pain, constipation, later with diarrhea. There's a characteristic rash, but it's not always present. Lewis and Clark were not trained physicians, could easily have missed it. It leads to intestinal perforation, often untreated in the 3rd week. Problem with this, nobody else was sick, and typhoid is highly contagious when it's in the water. So as in the water that Floyd drank, I would think somebody else should have gotten it. Shigellosis is another possibility. But then most commonly this starts with bloody diarrhea, then followed with fever and rectal pain, It can have a very high mortality untreated, but it's usually a mild disease, also very contagious, and again, nobody else had it. So I think the most likely explanation is the most common. It was just food poisoning, probably from Staphylococcus. I had this when I was a sophomore in medical school. I thought I was going to die. I was vomiting, diarrhea. It's the first time in my life I ever had to go to the ER, and only time in my life I had to go to the ER for a medical issue. My brother finally dragged me to the ER about 3 o'clock in the morning. But I think it was worsened probably by the captains. They gave him more of these cathartics. They bled him, and with all best intent, of course. We will, however, I'll admit, never know for sure what he died from. Next episode I want to talk about is what happened when they crossed the Bitterroot Mountains. This is the start of the Rockies. They started early September, and the snow started, and one of the gas wrote, "Is most terrible mountains I ever beheld." I tried climbing this when I was 25 years old in the best shape of my life in the middle of summer, and I found it almost impassable. I don't know how these guys did it in the snow with what they had. September 16th, they had run out of food, and I want my wife to look at this last sentence. They killed a colt, which they supped heartily on and thought it was good meal. Several days later, they encountered the Nez Perce Indians, who gave them roots and things that were bread. And they ate and got a little better, but next day, Captain Lewis shows up with the rest of the men, and Clark tells them, "Don't eat too much, it'll make you sick." Of course, they didn't listen, and what happens is they're very sick. They complain of a lax and heaviness at the stomach. A lax is diarrhea. They were so weak the next day, they couldn't even walk. They had to put them on horses to carry them along. So, what is this? A period of extreme exertion, starvation, only food is protein, and ingestion of carbohydrates leads to weakness, lethargy, and diarrhea. Or if you're my residents, I'd ask for a show of hands, so I'll just skip to the answer. It's probably refeeding syndrome. Many textbooks say this was reported in the Bible. I have not been able to find any references in the Bible. If somebody knows one, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know. But it was first described by Flavius Josephus in the 1st century AD, following the end of the siege of Jerusalem. It got the term refeeding syndrome in World War II when it was noted what happened to survivors of concentration and prisoner of war camps. And again, in the 1960s, when famine struck Africa, and many children suffered from this. I won't go into the biochemistry because I don't even remember what any of these letters mean anymore now that I'm retired. But basically, the carbohydrate and insulin lead to a cellular influx of phosphorus and magnesium, and you get acute hypophosphatemia and hypomagnesemia. Those old enough to remember when TPN was first introduced, when we was started in ICU patients, they all got hypophosphatemic and hypomagnesemic. We weren't smart enough to know this, but all we knew is they needed extra phosphorus and magnesium. So what happened to our heroes? Meriwether Lewis returns in December 1806. He's been gone for 3.5 years. Jefferson has received 2, maybe 3 letters from him and thought he was dead multiple times. But is said as if he returned from the moon. He became the governor of the Louisiana Territory, but he committed suicide in 1809. Now, there's some speculation that this could have been a robbery gone wrong and he was shot. But outside this talk, Lewis, unfortunately, was probably bipolar and alcoholic. Clark, who knew him better than anyone alive, wrote, "I fear the weight of his mind has overcome him." Clark had a slightly happier ending. He married a cousin, raised a family, became a brigadier general, was the first governor of Missouri Territory, later was commissioner of Indian Affairs, and he died at home of his elder son, appropriately named Meriwether Lewis Clark. So what can we learn from Lewis and Clark? Obviously not surgical techniques, but we can learn other things that have made surgeons, may I use the word great, over the last century, century and a half, and hopefully in the future. This is how to overcome adversity. We all had adversity, bad outcomes. Lewis and Clark had adversity. Men dying, men being sick. They had floggings when there was disobedience. But no matter what, and they recorded this over 24 times, how bad it was, the last line in their journal was, "We proceeded on." I want to thank you for the great honor of giving this talk.